Thank you for being here. Today we're exploring a concept that has shaped human behavior, politics, morality, and imagination for more than 1,000 years. The idea of hell, a place of eternal punishment, fire, and torment, a place where those who break divine rules supposedly suffer forever. But who invented it? And why did it become one of the most powerful tools in religious history? The answers aren't simple, but they are fascinating, and once you understand them, you'll never see this concept the same way again. Let's start with a question. If you were designing a belief system and wanted people to follow it without question, what would you use to keep them in line? Rewards can work, but rewards lose their power if people doubt they'll ever receive them. Fear, on the other hand, is immediate, raw, and deeply effective. Fear can shape behavior faster than hope, and that's exactly why hell became central to so many religions. It wasn't born out of pure spiritual insight. It was constructed as a mechanism, a way to enforce loyalty when persuasion wasn't enough. When you look back at the earliest religious traditions, the afterlife wasn't about eternal torment. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the dead went to a shadowy underworld, but it wasn't a place of punishment. It was just a dull existence. In early Judaism, Sheol was similar, a pit or grave where all souls went, good or bad. There was no fiery hell yet, no eternal damnation. That means the concept we take for granted today wasn't there at the start. It had to evolve, and it evolved for reasons that were as much political as they were spiritual. One of the first seeds of hell appears in Zoroastrianism, an ancient Persian religion that introduced a strong dualistic view, a cosmic battle between good and evil, light and darkness, heaven and hell. This framework influenced many later faiths, including Christianity and Islam. In Zoroastrian thought, those who sided with evil faced punishment in the afterlife, while the righteous were rewarded. This was new, a moral sorting system tied to eternal consequences. It added weight to ethical choices. But even then, the emphasis was on cosmic justice, not eternal torture. The real fire and brimstone image came later, and it wasn't born in the clouds. It was forged on the ground, in the machinery of organized power. The ancient Greeks also contributed to the story. Their underworld, Hades, had different regions, including Tartarus, a place of punishment for the wicked. But again, this was for gods and heroes who crossed cosmic lines, not ordinary people. It was mythology, not a universal threat. So, when did hell become everyone's problem? That shift happened when religions began competing for dominance, and leaders realized that controlling behavior required something stronger than promises of paradise. People might gamble with hope, but few gamble with terror. By the time Christianity emerged, the Roman Empire was vast, unstable, and full of competing cults and philosophies. In that environment, ideas that offered absolute certainty and absolute consequences had an advantage. The early Christian texts talk about judgment, but they're often vague. Outer darkness, gnashing of teeth, symbolic language. The idea of eternal fire appears in a few places, but it wasn't a detailed geography of hell yet. That map would come later, drawn not by prophets but by theologians and poets. Here's what many people don't realize. The vivid imagery of hell that dominates art and culture didn't come from the Bible. It came from literature like Dante's Inferno, written in the 14th century. Dante took fragments of scripture, mixed them with medieval imagination, and gave the world a hell you could picture. 9 circles, rivers of blood, demons with pitchforks. His work wasn't divine revelation. It was poetry, but it was powerful. It fixed the idea of hell in the Western mind like never before, and the church understood that power. Preachers began using those images to grip congregations with fear. Sermons like Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God painted hell so vividly that people wept in terror, and fear-driven obedience became a cornerstone of religious authority. Why did this work so well? Because hell attacks something primal, our survival instinct. It takes our fear of death, the most basic fear we have, and multiplies it infinitely. It says death isn't the end, it's the beginning of something worse, something eternal. And the only escape is submission. Believe, obey, conform. That psychological leverage is enormous. When you convince people that doubt equals damnation, you don't just control their actions, you control their thoughts. Even questioning becomes dangerous because the stakes are infinite. That's why hell isn't just a doctrine, it's a tool of thought control. And for centuries it worked almost flawlessly. But was it ever consistent? No. The details of hell changed constantly. In some traditions it was eternal fire, in others separation from God, in others annihilation. This inconsistency tells us something important. Hell wasn't revealed. It was constructed, piece by piece, culture by culture, often to solve practical problems. When heretics threatened unity, hell was invoked to silence them. When rulers wanted obedience, hell became their enforcer. Even the doctrine of eternal torment, so central to many versions of Christianity, was hotly debated for centuries. Some early theologians believed in universal salvation, that eventually all souls would be reconciled. But that view faded because fear was more useful than hope. And it wasn't just Christianity. Islam has its own depictions of Jahannam, layered with imagery of fire and punishment. Hindu and Buddhist traditions speak of Naraka, realms of suffering for those who accumulate bad karma. But here's the key. These ideas became more elaborate when institutions needed leverage. They were shaped less by evidence of the divine and more by the psychology of control. And this reveals something uncomfortable. Hell says more about human power structures than about cosmic truth. It reflects our tendency to rule through fear when persuasion fails. Fast forward to today, the doctrine of hell is still preached, but its grip is weakening. Surveys show that even among believers, fewer accept a literal hell. Many reinterpret it as metaphor because eternal torture clashes with modern ethics. Think about that. The idea that once terrified entire civilizations is now being softened because people find it morally offensive. That shift tells us something profound. Morality isn't coming from these doctrines. It's judging them. Our ethical sense is evolving beyond fear-based systems. And that evolution is one reason religion's authority is eroding. And yet, the shadow of hell lingers. For people raised with it, fear can persist long after belief fades. Psychologists call this residual fear conditioning. Even former believers sometimes struggle with anxiety about eternal punishment, despite rejecting the doctrine intellectually. That shows how deep this idea runs. It wasn't just taught, it was carved into the emotional brain. Which makes sense, because hell was never about logic. It was about terror, and terror bypasses reason. That's why undoing its grip takes more than arguments. It takes time, compassion, and often therapy. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a question. What happens to morality, meaning, and purpose when fear is removed from the foundation? If hell was a tool to keep people in line, what keeps us ethical without it? The answer isn't hard to find. It's already here. In societies where belief in hell is weakest, crime rates aren't soaring, they're often lower. Cooperation, empathy, and justice don't vanish. They thrive because they're rooted in something deeper than fear, our shared humanity. That truth dismantles the last defense of doctrines like hell, the claim that we need them to be good. We don't. We never did. We needed them when power structures depended on fear, but humanity is outgrowing that stage, and that might be the most hopeful part of this story. When fear fades, freedom begins. When we look at medieval Europe, it becomes clear that hell wasn't just a theological concept. It was political capital. During this period, the church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the dominant power structure across much of the continent. Kings and emperors sought its blessing to rule. Ordinary people depended on it for salvation, and the fear of hell was the glue that held this authority together. Preachers didn't just speak about eternal punishment, they weaponized it. The sermons of the Middle Ages were graphic. Priests described rivers of fire, demons tearing flesh, worms consuming bodies forever. These weren't abstract metaphors, they were vivid psychological assaults. Art reinforced the message. Stained glass windows, frescoes, and illuminated manuscripts portrayed hell as a grotesque spectacle of suffering. Why such detail? Because images bypass logic. They plant themselves in the subconscious, where fear lives. And fear was essential for compliance. When literacy was rare, pictures became theology for the masses. Consider the practice of indulgences. The church taught that sins could be forgiven, but penalties remained to shorten your time in purgatory. A kind of pre-hell. You could buy indulgences. At its peak, this wasn't just doctrine, it was a business model. Fear of hell turned into currency. People sold land, emptied savings, and lived in poverty to purchase spiritual security. That fear financed cathedrals and armies. It shaped politics, sparked wars, and even triggered revolutions. Without hell, that economy of salvation collapses, and leaders knew it. Which is why defending hell wasn't optional. It was survival. The Crusades carried this logic to extremes. Soldiers were promised absolution and paradise for killing in the name of God. For those hesitant to fight, preachers reminded them of the alternative, eternal flames. This framing made violence not just permissible, but holy. It shows how fear of hell and hope of heaven work as a pair. One pushes, the other pulls. Together they override natural empathy and rational hesitation, and this isn't ancient history. It's a case study in how existential threats can justify almost anything. Psychologically, hell works because it exploits two vulnerabilities: our fear of pain and our inability to grasp infinity. The idea of endless suffering is so overwhelming that the mind can't fully process it, yet it feels absolute. Modern neuroscience explains why this is effective. When we imagine physical pain, the brain activates regions similar to those involved in real pain. So hearing vivid descriptions of hell doesn't just scare us abstractly, it simulates torment in our nervous system. Combine that with eternity, a concept beyond human comprehension, and you have the ultimate deterrent. Nothing else compares, not prison, not exile, not death. Hell is infinite, and infinite punishment demands absolute obedience. But there's a cost. Systems that rule by fear produce compliance, but they also produce trauma. Historical records and modern studies show that believers deeply conditioned by hell often struggle with anxiety, guilt, and obsessive behaviors. The doctrine was supposed to save souls, but it scarred minds. Even today, former believers report what psychologists call religious trauma syndrome, often linked to hell-based teachings. These effects last decades, which raises a hard question. If an idea harms people this deeply, can it be called good? Or is it a moral relic of an era when power mattered more than well-being? The Renaissance and Enlightenment began to crack this system. As literacy spread and people read scripture for themselves, they noticed something unsettling. The Bible's teaching on hell was less clear than they were told. Some words translated as eternal didn't always mean forever in the original languages. Concepts like Gehenna referred to actual places, garbage dumps outside Jerusalem, not metaphysical torture chambers. These discoveries didn't erase hell overnight, but they planted seeds of doubt. If hell was so central, why wasn't it explained consistently? Why did interpretations change across centuries? Those questions threaten not just doctrine, but authority. Because if fear was built on shaky ground, what else was? The Protestant Reformation exposed these cracks. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin challenged indulgences, but most didn't abandon hell, they needed it too. Fear still functioned as a control mechanism, but the monopoly shattered. Competing sects used hell against each other, each claiming the other faced eternal fire. This weaponization didn't weaken the doctrine, it intensified it. For ordinary people, that meant more fear, not less, but it also meant more contradictions. And contradictions are the slow poison of belief. When every group says, "We're right," and everyone else burns, the logic of eternal punishment starts to look arbitrary. And arbitrariness erodes credibility. Fast forward to the modern era. Science challenged the cosmology that supported hell. Telescopes revealed a universe larger than Scripture ever imagined. Geology and biology showed an Earth shaped by natural processes, not divine punishment. Psychology reframed behavior as influenced by environment, and biology, not demons. These insights didn't just shift facts, they shifted frameworks. Hell depends on a world where authority dictates truth and fear enforces obedience. Modernity builds a world where evidence trumps dogma. And in that world, hell feels out of place, like a medieval ghost haunting a rational age. But even as belief in hell declines in developed nations, its shadow remains in language, literature, and culture. Politicians still use fear of chaos, of enemies, of moral collapse in ways eerily similar to old sermons. Advertisers tap into insecurity the way preachers once tapped into guilt. This continuity shows that while hell as a doctrine may fade, the psychology that made it powerful is still with us, which means understanding its invention isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing the tools of control in the present. In the next and final section, we'll explore how hell persists in modern minds, why some people cling to it despite doubts, and what life looks like when fear no longer drives morality. Even as hell's literal flames cool in the modern imagination, its psychological heat lingers. For millions raised under its shadow, fear doesn't vanish the day belief fades. Former believers often describe something like phantom pain. The body remembers even when the mind rejects. This phenomenon, which psychologists call residual conditioning, explains why people who no longer believe in eternal punishment still wake at night gripped by anxiety about it. Childhood is where these fears take root, and anything learned young, reinforced by authority and emotion, can become almost indelible. Consider the developmental stage when most children first hear about hell, between 5 and 10 years old. At that age, abstract reasoning is limited. They can't weigh probabilities or parse metaphor. When an adult says, "Eternal fire awaits the disobedient," it registers as fact, not allegory. Fear embeds itself before logic can intervene. Later, even when reason dismantles the doctrine, that early wiring remains. This is why so many deconverts struggle not with intellectual doubt, but with visceral dread. Hell, from the start, was engineered for this. It bypasses rational filters and strikes the limbic system, where survival instincts live. That's what makes it so effective and so hard to uproot. The consequences are profound. Studies show that children exposed to intense hell-based teachings report higher levels of anxiety, guilt, and intrusive thoughts as adults. Some develop obsessive behaviors, checking and rechecking prayers or rituals to avoid damnation. Others carry chronic guilt over harmless acts because they were told such acts endangered their soul. This isn't an accident. It's a feature of fear-based systems. When your highest stakes are eternal, every small failure becomes catastrophic. That pressure shapes personalities, decisions, even careers. It limits curiosity because curiosity risks doubt, and doubt risks hell. So the doctrine not only controlled behavior, it colonized imagination. But here's the paradox. As societies modernize, the more hell is preached, the more fragile belief becomes. Why? Because extreme threats invite scrutiny. When leaders say, "Obey or burn forever," people eventually ask, why would a loving God create such a place? And that question exposes the logical fault line in the whole system. If eternal punishment exists, it means infinite suffering for finite mistakes. A scale of justice that feels monstrous, not merciful. Once that realization dawns, fear turns into dissonance. Some double down, inventing rationalizations about free will or divine mystery. Others walk away, and among those who walk, many describe the same moment. Not relief first, but grief. Grief for years spent terrified of an illusion. Globally, this shift is accelerating. In countries with high education and social stability, belief in hell drops dramatically. Scandinavia, for instance, reports some of the lowest rates of hell belief and some of the highest measures of well-being. The United States, long a stronghold of fire and brimstone preaching, now sees declining adherence to literal hell, even among evangelical. Younger generations, raised with internet access and exposed to pluralism, increasingly reject the idea as ethically indefensible. They look at billions of people born into other faiths and ask, is eternal torture their fate for being born elsewhere? That question alone dismantles centuries of dogma. Yet hell persists in some corners because fear serves power. Where institutions feel threatened by science, by secularism, by social change, the rhetoric of hell often intensifies. It's the last weapon in the arsenal, the ultimate or else. But like all fear tactics, it works best in isolation. In tightly controlled environments, rural communities, authoritarian states, hell still looms large. Where diversity and dialogue thrive, it withers, because hell depends on silence. It survives when questions can't breathe. What happens when societies let go of hell? Critics warn of moral collapse. History says otherwise. Nations with low belief in hell don't spiral into chaos. They often rank highest in social trust, equality, and quality of life. Why? Because morality rooted in empathy and reciprocity outperforms morality rooted in terror. When people help others because they care, not because they fear punishment, ethical behavior becomes more authentic and stable. Fear enforces compliance only under surveillance. Remove the watchtower and the system collapses. But when values grow from within, they endure. This is why the decline of hell doesn't mark the end of morality. It marks its maturation. Still, letting go of hell isn't easy for everyone. It can feel like pulling a thread that unravels your whole worldview. For some, it means losing community, identity, and certainty in one stroke. That's why conversations about hell shouldn't be framed as attacks, but as invitations. What if meaning and morality can thrive without fear? What if justice doesn't require infinite cruelty? These questions aren't just intellectual, they're liberating. They replace terror with curiosity, submission with autonomy. And that shift doesn't lead to despair, it leads to life, fully owned, fully present. Even as belief in hell declines, its cultural shadow stretches across the modern world. You see it in art, literature, and even entertainment. Dante's Inferno, written over 700 years ago, still inspires films, video games, and novels. Painters from Bosch to Blake filled canvases with terrifying visions of punishment, not because they believed every detail, but because hell grips the imagination. It dramatizes fear, guilt, and cosmic justice in ways no other concept does. That's why it endures in fiction, even when it fades in faith. Hell, in many ways, is humanity's most vivid metaphor for the consequences of moral failure. Politics, too, borrows its language. Listen to leaders describe enemies as evil, promising they will burn for their crimes. The phrasing echoes old sermons. The structure is the same. Define an outgroup, portray them as damned, and rally the in-group with promises of deliverance. Hell may no longer dominate pulpits and secular societies, but its logic animates ideological battles everywhere. When someone says they'll pay for what they've done, they invoke the same impulse that made eternal punishment plausible, the craving for ultimate justice. The question is whether that craving, left unchecked, breeds compassion or cruelty. The modern world tries to answer that by replacing fear with fairness. Legal systems move from vengeance to rehabilitation. Ethics shifts from divine command to human well-being. But the residue of hell complicates this transition. many still struggle with punitive instincts, the reflex to see suffering as the price for wrongdoing. In some sense, hell didn't just shape theology, it shaped psyche. It trained generations to think justice equals pain. Undoing that wiring takes time, but evidence suggests it's possible. Countries that abandon harsh punitive measures often see lower crime rates, proving that empathy outperforms terror as a social glue. Why then do fear-based narratives resurface even outside religion? Because fear sells. Media thrives on it. Politicians exploit it. Corporations leverage it to market security products. The formula is timeless. Identify a danger, amplify its stakes, then offer the solution. Hell was the original template for this. The fear of eternal flames, paired with the promise of salvation, mirrors countless modern scripts. Without us, disaster awaits. Understanding hell's invention helps us see these parallels for what they are. Strategies, not inevitabilities. And recognizing strategies is the first step toward freedom from them. What does a future without hell look like? That depends on what replaces it. If fear was the old currency, what will be the new? Evidence points to three forces: reason, empathy, and interdependence. Reason dismantles myths by demanding evidence. Empathy provides a moral compass rooted in shared experience rather than decrees. Interdependence, our growing awareness that survival depends on cooperation, makes cruelty not just immoral but irrational. In this framework, morality doesn't need eternal punishment to function. It thrives because kindness sustains communities better than fear ever could. Yet letting go of hell isn't just about belief, it's about language, art, and identity. For centuries, people oriented their lives around escaping this place. Its imagery filled their stories, its terror shaped their choices. When that disappears, what fills the space? For some, it's secular humanism. For others, spirituality without dogma. For many, it's the simple pursuit of meaning in the finite. The common thread is this: the horizon shifts from eternity to now. Life stops being a test for the next world and becomes an experience to be lived fully in this one. And that, ironically, might deliver the very peace hell claimed to offer: freedom from fear, clarity about values, and a morality grounded not in terror but in trust. So when we ask, who invented hell? The answer is layered. It wasn't whispered by gods in sacred groves. It was built by humans, brick by brick, sermon by sermon. Out of fear, control, and longing for justice, it served its purpose for empires and churches, but its reign is ending. The flames that once lit the corridors of power are dying out, replaced by a quieter, steadier light. Understanding. The more we study ideas like hell, the more we see them for what they are. Not eternal truths, but historical tools. And tools, once recognized, can be set aside. That's the story of hell. Not as prophecy, but as psychology. Not as divine decree, but as human design. And now, as its grip loosens, humanity faces a choice: cling to fear or embrace freedom. The future, it seems, belongs to those who choose the latter.